everyone, today I'm going to be doing a short review of The Witness for the Dead by Katherine Addison. This is not a sequel, but it is, as the cover says, in the world of the Goblin Emperor. So The Goblin Emperor was one of my absolute favorite books that I read last year. It was published a few years before that, maybe like 2017. Should I check? 2014. Okay, so The Goblin Emperor came out in 2014, and it's a standalone. And then this summer, we got Witness for the Dead, which is the only other book that Katherine Addison has written under this pen name, except for The Angel of the Crows, which came out last summer, and which we are not going to talk about. So The Goblin Emperor became one of my favorite books of all time, but it's definitely not for everyone, and Witness for the Dead has a lot of the same characteristics. And of course, it's kind of tense when a follow-up to a favorite book is coming out after a while, and, you know, some things really are better left alone, but I also really wanted more in that world. So this was a good kind of follow-up. It references the events of the Goblin Emperor, but it is about an important but minor character from the Goblin Emperor, and it has many of the same characteristics, but is definitely not a sequel. At least not in the traditional sense. So if you really liked The Goblin Emperor, I think you will definitely enjoy The Witness for the Dead. Probably if you disliked The Goblin Emperor because you found the names too confusing, or the language annoying, or the plot too slow and character-driven, avoid. Definitely avoid. All of those things that might make someone not enjoy this book are things that I really liked about The Goblin Emperor, so definitely not an issue for me. But I think a book like this will always be kind of polarizing, especially for fantasy fans, because either it works for you or it really, really will not work for you. So Witness for the Dead is about a minor but important character from the Goblin Emperor named Tharas Selahar, who is, he's basically a priest. He is called a witness for the dead, and he can sort of see or experience the memories of recently deceased people, but it's not like a superpower. He can only see certain things and only for so long after they've died. So it's a bit of a blessing and a curse at times. But it's a vocation that he has chosen and is drawn to really strongly, and he feels a really strong sense of duty towards his work. And that is really the character's defining trait. This is a book about a very sad, lonely person who has chosen duty and what he thinks is right over basically everything else. And he has a loss in his past, which is actually never really fully explained in this book and is in The Goblin Emperor, but basically there was a point where he had to choose between love and duty, and he chose duty. And this is something that the character is clearly not over, although he might not necessarily choose differently if he was in the same situation again. So like The Goblin Emperor, this book is really more of a character study. It's about Selahar, who has chosen to go to this more remote provincial city to resume his calling as a priest since the events of the Goblin Emperor. And so he's serving as the witness for the dead for this city, and he's just in a really awkward political position because he was appointed directly by the archprelate, and so he's not really part of the sort of priestly and religious hierarchy or the political hierarchy in this city, and nobody really seems to know where he fits in. And he just really doesn't care about politics, but basically nobody else believes that because they are all super political. So he's just, you know, constantly surrounded by people that want to know, does he rank higher than them? Does he rank lower than them? What is he secretly scheming? And the answer is nothing. He's not scheming anything, but he knows they won't believe him, so he just kind of doesn't even try. He's not a character that really stands up for himself. Through the course of this book, he deals with several different, basically, cases and situations through the course of his work. The most important one, probably in terms of such plot as there is there is a murdered woman who's been thrown into the canal that is found, and it basically becomes responsible for figuring out what happened to her, first her identity, and then why she was killed. So that's probably the strongest through line in this book, but there are others as well that sort of interconnect and they all come together, but I would definitely not call this a murder mystery by any means. There is a murder in it, and the main character does solve the murder, but it's kind of in the course of his duties. It's not, he's not really a conventional detective character at all. And so because of this, there are plot lines that get resolved in this story, but there is definitely not one central plot. And even in terms of the character, compared to the Goblin Emperor, I think Selahar evolves probably less, because the Goblin Emperor, if you haven't read it, which you should read it. It's about Maya, who as a teenager is suddenly forced out of exile to unexpectedly become emperor. And so he has to learn a lot of things and grow a lot. He's a teenager. He has a lot of growing and maturing and coming of age to do. And Selahar is a more established character. So does he go through change and emotions and stuff in this book? Yes, but he is like Maya. He's a character who basically is trying to do what he thinks is right, and he basically sticks to that throughout the book, and there are consequences at different times of that, some good, some bad. It can be kind of hard to read about a character that's sad. It was a character that I enjoyed spending time with. I did feel like there was a sense of growth and progression in this character. I did feel like he had been through some very, tough events in his past, and it felt like maybe this story was like about the start of his healing process. It definitely wasn't the whole thing. Not a lot gets changed or resolved by the end, and I don't even know if I can give spoilers for a book like this, but he moves along his journey, and it feels like certain things develop, but it's definitely not a sense of closure or just a really concrete story at all. It's more just like getting to spend a certain amount of time in this character's head. So the things that I really enjoyed about this book were a lot of the same things that I enjoyed about the Goblin Emperor. I loved this as a character study, and I do enjoy slow character-driven books, at least some of the time, if they're done right. I really loved this fantasy world. It's not a typical fantasy world at all, but it's also not totally unconventional in terms of it has world building to a certain extent, but you don't ever totally get a grasp on it. I guess there's a lot of stuff that's just never explained, but what Katherine Addison does really well is convey this incredible sense of depth and history and culture that you as the reader are just barely scratching the surface of. It's not like a Sanderson epic where you get to learn all these details about the world. It's like you learn little individual details, and that creates a sense of depth. Honestly, I get that feeling reading Lord of the Rings versus, like, you can read the Silmarillion, you can read all this stuff, Tolkien had that world building, but if you just read like The Hobbit or Lord of the Rings, you get like some of it. Now, I don't think she's fleshed out this world anywhere near to the degree of Tolkien, but I get that feeling of like age and depth. Also, the characters in this world, they're not human. They are elves and goblins. But they're they're basically human, but sometimes they're described in a way where you remember, they have these physical characteristics that are not human. So that's kind of interesting to me. Also, she does something with the spoken language that I love, and that I thought it was going to be a huge turnoff when I read the first couple pages of The Goblin Emperor, and then I just immediately got what she was doing. So it kind of creates a feeling of a non-English language. Characters use a formal, informal mode of address with each other. So the formal, they use what we would call like the royal we, but that's any formal speech. You refer to yourself as we, and then the other person as you is formal, and then the informal is I and thou, which does date back to older forms of English. So if you're not used to it, at first it sounds like someone trying to write in like a faux old-timey language, but it's not that at all. She's doing a really specific sort of cultural, social, linguistic thing through English. I think it's super cool. I really enjoy it. I personally got used to it pretty quickly, and it just felt like part of the language. And then without the author having to tell you, you just pick up on all these distinctions. Like, are the characters calling each other you or thou? How close are they? It reflects something through the language that you would get from another language that normally you don't get in English. I think that's really cool. The setting itself also, it's kind of like steampunky gas lamp fantasy almost, but in this sort of very highly mannered empire where there's a lot of levels of manners and just, courtesy things like that, how you're supposed to act socially. The thing that I think a lot of people struggle with the Goblin Emperor that I always warn people about, the names are like intense and complicated, and there are people that have titles and names and multiple names, and it can be really hard to keep track of who's who at first. I mean, I feel like if you can get through like a Russian novel, you'll be fine with these books, but definitely a little bit of effort. And the Goblin Emperor had like a glossary of characters in the back, and this one doesn't. There are fewer characters, but yeah, so that can be a challenge. Something I saw a few reviewers mention about the Goblin Emperor is that they would have liked to see more of this world and different levels of society, because the Goblin Emperor is set completely at court. This book definitely delivers that. You get to see what a different city in this world is like, where there are some elements that tie over and some things where the culture is really different, religion's really different. There's a lot more ethnic and religious diversity and diversity of different walks of life in the characters in this book, and you get to see from a not emperor person's perspective what things are like. I really enjoyed that. Another thing I loved about this book, which is just personal to me, but a lot of one of the main plots has to do with an opera. Opera is very big in this world. It's what the, cultured people go to for their entertainment, which reminds me a lot of, 18th and 19th century Europe, basically. And I'm a musician. I'm a classical musician. I love opera, actually, like real opera. So I found that the singer characters and the world of opera as it's shown was super relatable to me. I really liked how she did it. I think she basically, obviously it's describing an opera that doesn't exist in the real world, but it definitely rang true. I really enjoyed it. I felt like the characters of the people that were like involved in that world felt accurate. I had fun imagining, what these operas would be like. There's an opera that's getting staged that instead of being about noble people, it's about people that work in a factory, and that's super controversial. And I don't know, I really liked this aspect, this detail to the story, and just getting to be part of that opera world in this fictional fantasy setting. That's something I would love to see more of. The music isn't super described or anything like that, so I think I mentioned in my monthly wrap up from the first time I read this book, I kind of imagined this combination of like Baroque opera and maybe like, I don't know if you've ever listened to Chinese opera and that style of singing, but somehow I imagined a combination of like a kind of some of these forms of opera that are like very highly like ritualized and mannered, where you have to really be in the know to understand what's going on and appreciate it. And yeah, that's sort of just my mental image of what the music would sound like. I don't know if Katherine Addison is going to or should revisit this world again. I feel like this story really worked. It was self-contained. It connected to the first book without really actually building on it or anything. If she can do something else like this, I would love to revisit this world, but I think if she can't, then she should probably just leave it alone. So yeah, I don't know what I'm hoping for, but I definitely enjoyed this as a follow-up. The Goblin Emperor is still by far my favorite. I was looking through the book at one point, just trying to find something because I wanted to reference a detail for this review. And I just found myself, I was just sitting there reading the book, like in the middle, because I just loved that book so much. But this was also great. I think if you liked The Goblin Emperor, you'll like it. If you haven't read The Goblin Emperor, read that one first. Why start with this? But, I feel like The Goblin Emperor is an underrated book. Although I kind of get it because I understand why some people wouldn't be into it. And I haven't seen a lot about The Witness for the Dead either, although I haven't been watching as many YouTube videos lately as I would like to have time for. But let me know down in the comments if you're thinking of reading this, if you've read The Goblin Emperor, if you have read it. Let me know your thoughts.